My name is Tom Broderick, Jr. I'm the mayor of the city of Anderson. I'd first like to thank all of you for coming out today and taking a few moments of your time out to hear some of the things that I'd like to speak about that I think is important for our community. And I know you guys are all busy and you've got a lot going on across the state, so again, thank you. I'd like to introduce to you the folks that are standing behind me right now. Over here to my right is Warren Warren, same first name, last name. His parents made it easy for him. Warren is the Assistant Chief of Police for our Community Policing Department. Also next to him is Assistant Chief Mike Lee. Mike is the Assistant Chief of our Uniform Division. And then over here behind me to this right is Jake Brown, who is our Chief of Police for the city of Anderson. All three of these individuals have 20-plus years experience on the Anderson Police Department. For all of us, as you know, 2020 has been a tough year. It's a year that most of us are going to be talking about for many years to come. We all know that it started off after the holidays, shortly thereafter, with the word of the coronavirus. And then as we all become to take that serious, that we realized that we were going to have to do things such as social distancing and so forth to try to protect ourselves, our friends, and our families from this virus. Unfortunately, as we begin to do social distancing, something we'd never heard of before, but most of us, we become to realize that we really weren't spending as much time with each other as we should, but that the consequence of that, we really found ourselves becoming more isolated, if you will, than integrated. And I think some of those things, unfortunately, has played not well into the circumstances that we found ourselves in as we started to come out of the coronavirus epidemic and as we begin to try to reopen our economy across the state. It was just shortly after that we all got another huge shock that came about, which with the death and the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I think like most Americans, we were all shocked and outraged at what we saw, taken back quite a bit, and it began to open up the door again to discussions about some of the injustices that is somewhat systemic and problematic throughout our country. That being the case, shortly after that, we began to see demonstrations and protests and folks speaking and trying to make sure that people in important positions and important positions of policymaking heard the concerns of the community. And here in Anderson, we had, I think, at least 3 different demonstrations, and I think we're scheduled to have another. And we tried to listen to what was going on, and myself and Chief Brown began to talk about things that we needed to do in our own community to make sure that we were doing the right thing. We were very aware that in our own community, we've been very fortunate not to have the type of incident that we saw in Minneapolis or some of the later incidents that we've seen, such as the ones recently in Atlanta. But nonetheless, we're not perfect, and we recognize that there's always room for improvement. And so we issued a joint statement, which we left on the tables for you folks, which I think hopefully most of you got a copy of. And we issued statements with regards to our feelings about the circumstances. And we noted in there, I won't read it because you can read it yourself, but a couple of important points that we noted that the death of Mr. Floyd violated his fundamental rights that we believe that all fair-minded Americans stand for, and that law enforcement is in place to protect all of us. It's to serve the community at large without regard to a person's color, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. And of course, it is to be carried out free of any discriminatory practice. We believe that police have a tremendous obligation to serve the public in a manner that doesn't violate their constitutional rights. And of course, this includes the use of excessive force. So as we announced those principles, we also wanted to make it clear that we felt that the use of force that was exhibited with Mr. Floyd was totally inappropriate. We already have in place and had in place policies and general orders that prevent the use of excessive force during the time of arrest or during the time of practicing the law enforcement. But we wanted to make it clear to our officers and to the public in general that we did not approve of the use of a chokehold for the purposes that have been displayed. And so in our June 11th correspondence, we indicated that we were banning the use of chokeholds by police to restrain or control a suspect during an arrest or during a time that we already had them in control. So an example of Mr. Floyd's case, he clearly was on the ground, he was handcuffed, he wasn't going anywhere, and to use that method for the extended period of time that he did was simply using deadly force, which was excessive under the circumstances in our view. And we wanted to make sure that our officers and the public in general understood that we believed that to be the case. And so we put out that directive. And then unfortunately, shortly thereafter, about 50 hours or so later, we had our own incident in our own town where an officer was videotaped at a time that he was in the process of doing an investigation and subsequently taking a person into custody, where he is seen putting his arm around the neck of the individual and pulling him up off his feet and down onto the ground in a restraining manner in order to complete the taking of him into custody. Upon first blush, when we looked at that, we're like everyone else who's seen those videos for the first time. We were disturbed by that image. It appeared that it could very well be excessive. We obviously didn't have all the facts or circumstances at the time. We only saw a clip that apparently was edited, but it certainly didn't look good to us. And so we immediately took steps to take action to place the two officers that were at the scene of that incident, including the officer who took the acts I just described, and place them on administrative leave pending an ongoing investigation. That investigation began immediately and has continued and is ongoing, and we expect it to wrap up in the next few days. The investigation is being done thoroughly. It's being done internally under state law. I want to emphasize, because this is something I've been asked about by different folks, under state law in Indiana, neither myself as a mayor nor the chief as the chief of police can summarily dismiss or terminate an officer for wrongdoing. We can suspend them or put them on leave, if you will, but that is subject to investigation, and it's also subject to final action by the safety board. In this case, what is going on, the investigation is continuing. As I said, when it is completed, it will go up the chain of command, ultimately to the chief, who will review it, and then he will make his recommendations for what discipline, if any, would be warranted, and that will be most likely presented to the safety board, and then the safety board will make the ultimate decision. The safety board here in Indiana, most communities, is made up of 3 individuals that are appointed by the mayor. In our case, we have folks that have been serving on there for over 4 years, and we believe that they would look at any case such as this in a fair and just manner. An employee who is terminated or who has a sanction that's greater than 5 days of suspension is entitled to have a hearing on the merits before the safety board. So that's another requirement that's within the law. We're aware that in some states, apparently, we saw in Minnesota and Atlanta, where folks were terminated what appeared to be nearly summarily. Again, that's not allowed here in Indiana. So we've done everything legally that we can do at this point in time with regards to this matter, and we continue to express our desire that the investigation be done promptly, but at the same time that it be done thoroughly. In the meantime, we are taking other actions within our department, within our city, to make sure that folks here in the public understand that what we're doing in a manner to make sure that law enforcement is provided in a fair and just manner, that it's done in a non-discriminatory manner. We support our police. We support the hard work that they have to do. We know that they're under a lot of stress often, that they often subject themselves to harm when they're out working for us. But at the same time, we also recognize that people can either make mistakes through negligence, they can make mistakes unintentionally, and sometimes they can make mistakes intentionally. But we will always be studying those things, and anytime we see someone who's done something that's outside our rules of conduct, or that we see someone who does something that violates the principles of justice or the principles of our constitutional rights, we obviously will take action, and we will do so in a prompt manner. I did ask Chief Brown when he became chief. He was assistant chief for a brief period of time at the end of last year, and he became officially chief January 1st of this year. I did ask him at that time, obviously before any of these things happen, to start looking at different new ideas that we might institute into our department. And one of the things that he looked at and began looking at in January was the institution of body cams for our police officers, and possibly the use of in-camera cars in our vehicles. We have been spending quite a bit of money the last few years of upgrading our vehicles. We've purchased about 65 new vehicles at this point. Over the last 4 years, we've been putting computers in those vehicles that weren't in there before, and we thought it made logical sense to look at other technological upgrades that protect not only officers but also citizens. Unfortunately, we got sidetracked with COVID when that came about, and so that sort of got put on hold. And then as this new incidents occurred, we began to look at this again. And we believe that our officers, from conversations we've had with them, the vast majority of our officers, substantial majority, would favor the use of body cams. It allows them to collect evidence when necessary. It also allows folks to see what really did happen, so it's transparent for the public. And at the same time, it also protects the officers against allegations of misconduct that in fact didn't occur. So it's really a win-win for everybody. It's a very expensive proposition. There's only about 25% or so of the police departments throughout the country that currently use them. It's moved back and forth over the years because of technology. Some of the earlier departments that tried to use them ran into issues and abandoned them. Also, they abandoned them because of the cost. But we feel like we're in a position to do this. And so I'm announcing today in front of all of you that is the intent, and we will be moving forward with the purchase of body cams for our police officers. In addition to that, we're going to move forward and purchase in-car cameras as well. A little history of that, I will tell you, back in the late 90s, the city of Anderson did have in-car cameras, but those were actually used with VCRs, or VHS, I guess, tapes and VCRs. It wasn't very efficient, obviously, but today, with the advent of the technology we have and the use of the cloud to store information, we think that's something that makes more sense. I will tell you that the cost primarily associated with these products is the storage, because there's so much data that is being collected on a regular basis. So we're going to institute that, and I've directed Chief Brown to continue on his efforts. He's already met with one vendor, but there are several in the country that are reliable and also have good products. So we obviously, with this investment, want to be able to get the best that we can get that makes the most sense, and then we'll be putting in place the rules and regulations to go along with that. In addition to that, we recognize that we have a strong community policing department. Assistant Chief Warren does a great job with it. We have several officers that work in that department and interface with folks on a regular basis, but we think that we can do more and need to do more. And so we are going to be reaching out to the various groups within our community that have concerns. We want to listen and hear what they have to say, and we want to build additional community policing efforts around those concerns and needs. That will be including meeting with organizers and leaders in churches, community activists, community leaders, various social agencies and organizations that deal with the public on a regular basis. Currently, we do a lot of work with kids. We do a lot of work with our schools. We do a lot of work with our seniors, but we think there's a hole missing there, and we want to fill that and make sure that we're in a position to listen and to act and to react in a way that makes sense to continue to build and keep good, strong public confidence in our department. We do pride ourselves, and have for years, on the Anderson Police Department and their professionalism. I'm an attorney. Practiced law for a little over 40 years, and I've dealt with the police department on really both sides of the aisle. I'm a former prosecutor, former criminal defense attorney, and I can tell you that these guys typically do a top-rate job. They do it in a fair and just manner, and they're always above board. But once in a while, you have incidents that occur that are unfortunate. But when they do, the good news is that we act promptly to rectify a mistake that may have been made. And if that's the case, we will do act, and will continue to act in a manner that I've described here today. We're going to, in addition to that, continue to listen. Listen to the folks that may be demonstrating. Listen to commentary that may even be made on social media, wherever it may be, in order to make sure that we're putting ourselves attuned with the needs and concerns of our citizens. We're going to continue to act to make sure that justice is carried out in a just way and in a fair way. We're going to, as I said, continue to do what we can do and need to do to protect the public from criminal behavior. And at the same time, we're going to do that in a way, though, that's fair and just. Keep in mind that in our belief that we need to work within our policies to make sure that they're always is de-escalation efforts. The use of force, while allowed under certain circumstances, should be the last thing that you're considering. It shouldn't be the first thing you're considering. We want to make sure that we take steps to speak with folks, to do everything we can to de-escalate a situation, and only use the most minimal force when needed, and never go to an excessive force situation. So we will continue to do that as we continue to work with our various officers who are on the street every day, around there right now working, and they are wanting to do a good job, and they want to make sure that folks know that they are doing it the best they can under the circumstances they find themselves in. And we will continue to do everything within our power to build and support the public trust. And so those are the things we wanted to let you know about today. I'm here to answer questions that you might have, and also the officers that stand behind me are also willing to do so. Is there anything else you gentlemen would like to add to that right now? Okay. I thank you so much again, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. You don't have any? Okay, I'm just kidding. Yes, sir.
Hey, Mayor, Darius Johnson with Fox 59.
Yes, sir.
My first question is, if we can go back to that incident, if you could tell me, or if any of the officers could tell me, what was the crime that Nice was actually being arrested for? I know he was charged with resisting arrest, but if you could just take me back to, you know, their initial encounter. Why was he being looked at? Why was he arrested?
Okay. Right now, the only information I have on this, and I think for the most part, neither one of these officers, you got a pitch? Thank you, sir. That's fine. Sure, buddy. The information that we all have at this moment in time that could officially be released is the content of the probable cause affidavit, which I'll be happy to get you a copy of that if you haven't already got it. It was filed in the Anderson City Court by the officer subsequent to his taking Mr. Nice into custody. It sets forth what he believed, I assume, was his probable cause. I can tell you that the judge, through the process we have, indicates that he found probable cause. The only charge, as you know, that he was actually arrested for, however, was the resisting itself. I do know that there were some issues of his a possible suspect in a hit-skip accident a day or two earlier. There are some indications about him throwing some things up against the side of a building, but I note that none of those things were charged. That is part of what the investigation is for. It's not only to determine whether or not he used excessive force, but whether or not he violated any law or policy, which would even include taking somebody into custody without probable cause, or possibly even having a stop with somebody that violates the Terry rules under the Supreme Court decisions. Yes, Ken?
Mayor, I believe Mr. Nice has filed a complaint with the police department for criminal charges against the officers. Will that also be handled internally, or will you turn that over to an outside agency?
I'm not aware. I've read that in the paper. I'm not aware. Are you aware whether or not he's filed a complaint? I will tell you that Mr. Nice has been cooperating with our investigation. I think early on there was probably some reluctance on that, some uncertainty. I'm just going to speculate on that a tad, but I will tell you that in reaching out with him through our investigators, he and his family have been cooperative and provided us, statements and information to this point that we've requested. That's not completed yet, but there is that level of cooperation. So far, everybody involved in the case has been providing cooperation to us. I don't know the exact date, but I know there are interviews set up with the two officers involved also later on in the next few days that have been set up. And so that's going to be going on. As far as his actually making a complaint per se, I don't know. I know he made a complaint, but I don't know that he made that demand. But I will tell you that this investigation will cover and does cover any misconduct that could have occurred, and that would include committing a crime. So if it's determined that it appears that a crime was committed, then we would handle that in the same way that we do most cases of this type, and that would be to put the information and case reports together, submit it to the local prosecutor's office for their review and determination as to what crimes, if any, should be filed, which is his ultimate discretion. And then if requested by the prosecutor, we would prepare a probable cause affidavit to go along with that.
Mayor, has any of either of those officers been disciplined in the past by the department?
Chief? No. I don't believe they have been, to my knowledge.
Was Mr. Nice armed at the time he was arrested?
It's my understanding he may have had some form of saw blade in his pocket.
How was the decision to ban chokeholds communicated to the police department?
And that's a good question. What happened was that the history I just gave you a moment ago occurred, and then the decision was made between the chief and I that we should do that. And in part of that was a follow-up as a result of some questions that a local newspaper, Mr. Knight here, had asked. And so we put together this statement to respond to some of his questions, and we included in that our decision to ban the chokeholds. Once that was done, as we were transmitting that to the newspaper, we felt that we needed to get that out to the local police as well. We didn't want them to read about it for the first time in the paper because the decision had just been made. So that was sent to them via email by the chief. Under our local rules that we have our department, police officers are required to look at their department email and read it at least once every day. And so the latest that Mr. Reynolds should have seen that communication and read it would have been the following day. And it was about 30 or so hours thereafter that this incident actually occurred. So that would have been the method. And of course, we obviously didn't anticipate this happening, but there would have been more follow-up distribution of that in a different manner on top of that had this not happened so quickly.
So, and Mayor, after this happened, Chief Brown, since then, has there been more communication to the staff to make sure that everybody knows about it, or has it been mentioned in any meetings or anything of that nature?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll let you answer that.
Yes. As Mayor mentioned, we still have some of those COVID restrictions that stops us from getting mass groups of people in one surrounding with each other. We've kind of done two different things. Just within the last day or two, Assistant Chief Lee met with all the supervisors under his command, and this is obviously a topic of discussion. In addition to that, we have another meeting coming up this afternoon with all of our defensive tactics instructors. And so the plan there being defensive tactics instructors get the clear message again and how they're going to teach, what other alternate methods are they going to teach in similar scenarios of taking someone into custody, and discuss at what point, can a chokehold be used, which is going to be slim to none life and death scenarios. So that's all kind of rolling, but to say, has everyone in the building sat in front of, a leader, a trainer? No, we haven't.
While we've got you here at the podium, Chief, the mayor was talking about the cameras, and it sounds like you all are determined that you're going to get them. Can you give us an idea of what you think the time frame might be, how quickly you might be able to move ahead on that? Is that something that's happening by the end of this year, or might it be next year?
Obviously, there'd be a few more vendors to vet just to make sure that we can, come up with what we believe is a quality product for our use and our application. Getting some of those quotes and numbers together. This is not something that's in this current year's budget sitting there now as a line item ready to use. So we'd likely have to, after maybe finalizing our decision on a company and having those other quotes available and those comparisons if questions are asked, it'd likely be something that we'd have to move on some reappropriations of some money and get other council or other board members and things involved to permit such purchase. So that would be the kind of first quickest stage. Another alternate would be potentially having a marrying of both between needing some money to be approved to be moved over and maybe changing a little bit of a budget line item. But the quicker way would be presenting something to council.
And I might add to that, not to cut you off, Chief, or you, Scott. We've already reached out to some folks in D.C. on the possibility of a grant. And so we're looking at that right now. The Congress has some bills moving that looks like they're going to have some traction to provide some local monies for these types of things. There had been an earlier grant available much earlier in the year, but again, because of everything going on, it just wasn't something got attended to. But we think that's going to be revisited by Congress. Plus, I know the President a day or two ago announced making some monies either available or freeing up the use of certain monies that are already available for these types of things. So we're looking at that as a possibility. As you know, we have over the last several years been able to build up a pretty strong operating balance. For those who aren't familiar, we about 4 years ago had about a $3.5 million operating balance, and today we have a $15+ million operating balance. And so we think, some capital available to us, even though we're going to be having some shortfalls this year because of COVID, most likely, in our income. We think that we have a buffer there that would allow us for a one-time type of purchase, even though it'd be a great purchase, a one-time purchase. So that could be done either through a request for a new appropriation of that money this year, or it could be done next year, or it could be put in the budget this year for next year. But if we find vendors that make sense, and we look at our, any kind of quoting or bidding requirements, then there's no reason why we couldn't go ahead and act right away to get that money appropriated by the council even yet this year. And that would be my plan, so long as we know we have our vendors and so forth in order, which I suspect can happen pretty quick.
Mayor, who would have the ability to turn on and off the body camera or the in-car cameras? Would there be something out of the officer's control, or would they have control over that?
The systems that we've been looking at are systems that are triggered as a result of a person taking a call. And so, as you know, we have a uniform dispatch center here now locally that we use, that both the county and the city use, and some other jurisdictions in our area. And so anytime an officer signs in or signs out of a call, whatever it may be, how minimal it may be or how serious it may be, that all runs through dispatch. The systems we've been looking at would be triggered at the time of that call, but it would also have the ability, because they would basically be running on a constant basis, but would only be capturing the time frame that the call is actually taking place. That way you don't eat up a lot of data space. But what it does, it has the potential that you can set it up where it can go back as far as, say, for example, 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, whatever you want it to set it at, before the person gets out of the car. So if I get the call now, I trigger it, and it captures the 2 minutes before and everything that happens during until the call ends. And that's the system we were looking at that we thought made a lot of sense to us. But that's not been determined yet, but that would be an example of what we'd be doing. An officer would have the ability to manually turn one on. Of course, it'd be a violation of rules if set up that way that they couldn't turn it off, but they could turn one on if for some reason uniquely it wasn't running because a call hadn't happened. But let's say they're out on the street, maybe they went in to get a pop or something and they run into something, they could trigger it. The downside to that is, and that's always been one of the concerns and problems with body cams in the first place, especially back in the day when you had limited storage, is that you relied on the officer to turn it on, and in the split moment of something going on that's exciting, sometimes it's the last thing you think about instead of the first, and so you miss out on things. So using a system we just discussed, we think would make some sense. I know the chief had indicated too he was going to check with some other departments in the area, not the area per se because there are not many around here that have them, but other departments that use it and get their advice and thoughts as well. Yes, sir.
Do you all know how long either of the officers have been with the department?
It's a little over 5 years.
A little over 5 years.
Roughly.
Yeah, I was thinking 4 or 5, but Chief says over 5 years.
Both together or 5 years each?
Both.
Yeah, they came on, if not literally together, one academy and class apart, so.
And also, here's another question, not sure if you're able or willing to answer. You said that you all will be having more communication. If you could easily talk to what would be the proper way to restrain someone who is resisting arrest, or just to be able to detain them?
I'll let these guys talk to that, but I mean, I'll just tell you from everything I've been reviewing with all this going on and so forth, one of the problems when you're talking about use of force has always been in law enforcement, similar to self-defense on the other side, is specific cases and what you do in that specific case. Because what the law requires is that a person not use excessive force, that they act in a reasonable manner, that a reasonable officer would be expected to act in under the similar set of circumstances. The problem is that so many circumstances are uniquely different, and the smallest little thing can make a big difference. And one of the things that's always a challenge is that you are required by the Supreme Court decisions to view it from the eyes of the officer as he viewed it himself at the time under those circumstances, or she. And so if you have somebody who's perceiving the person's going to flee, they're perceiving they've got a weapon on them potentially, they're going to draw it, those sorts of things, that person's going to react differently than a person who has a similar circumstance but doesn't have those perceptions. And so then the question becomes, quite frankly, let's face it, is the truth, the credibility of that, the facts and circumstances that you have to look at to determine is that reasonable? Did that make sense under the circumstances? So to go through each and every potential scenario that might come up with a police officer at any given time and how they should act, unless they're pretty extreme examples one way or the other, it would be hard to put together, say, a manual or something that goes through each and every scenario. That's why they tend to utilize, again, those Supreme Court principles that are set out in 2 or 3 different major Supreme Court cases. So if there's anything you think you should add to that, or be happy to step in here.
I just ditto that.
Yes, sir.
Can you explain why Officer Gravely was suspended as well?
Yes. Again, the suspension was done, and it's not really not a suspension technically, it's a leave, but it was done because she obviously was not just present there, but if you look at the video, and at the time this was done, about all the information we had was the video and the initial probable cause affidavit that got turned in shortly thereafter. So pretty limited documentation we had at that moment in time, but the documentation that we had, a video we had, suggested that she not only was there, but she obviously had a hold of the suspect, and that she did participate in as he went down, and that goes back in part to one of the questions asked earlier by the reporter over here, and that is, was there even probable cause in the first place? Was there a proper Terry stop in the first place? Should have you, as we've sort of discussed nationally, should have you been saying, hey, what are you doing? That sort of thing. So it seemed appropriate at the time to have that occur, subject again to the continuing review, and then ultimately, decision to be made on what should happen, if anything, beyond this. Yes, Andy.
I just want to see if I could get Chief Brown to chime in on this question. Prior to the chokehold ban, how often in the past or under what circumstances, and I know there are lots of, there's lots of variety to that, but how often would you say officers use chokeholds, and what were the limitations on their use prior to the ban?
I would say very rarely. We have other resources and tools to our disposal, whether it be OC spray, tasers, of course, depending on what's going on. Again, I want to preface, there's a lot of variables on a broad hypothetical, in short, we had other equipment, other options, and other tools that would more than likely be used well more often than a chokehold. But some of those tools cannot be applied if you are in close distance, if you are chest to chest, side by side with someone, and you don't have the reactionary time or the availability to deploy those tools. It also comes down to skill set of each officer. What is the individual that I'm trying to take into custody, what is their skill set? What is their body language? What is their fighting stance? Do I need to go a little harder than maybe just trying to do an arm lock and saying, please, sir, have a seat for me? And then comparative size of officer versus the individual they're trying to obtain. Do I feel with my size and my strength and my abilities that something lighter will even work from what I'm needing to accomplish right now? So all those variables play in to ultimately may or may not an officer decided to have used that chokehold as a method to get compliance and control. But again, there's a broad hypothetical question in that I'm trying to answer, but I can't just say, we would definitely, and each time would, rather do these 4 things instead of that. Well, because there's a lot of variables there that dictate that choice. And that choice has to sometimes happen like this.
Chief, when you and the mayor decided to ban chokeholds might apply to a range of different things that would restrict airflow to the brain, right? So what happened with George Floyd, where the officer had him pinned down with his knee on the back of the neck, that's among the things banned, I'm guessing. And was that technique taught to Anderson police officers and used in the past?
I think there's a little bit more of an asphyxiation issue as well with Mr. Floyd. How long he's laying on his stomach, how long his hands are behind his back, where you get into asphyxiation, suffocation as well, right? That's something that for a long time we've trained all of our officers to be very cognizant of. If someone's on their belly, even sometimes on their side, depending on their size and weight, and you are able to get them handcuffed, your very next step is to getting them sitting upright as fast as you can. I think that was lost in George Floyd's situation as well. So.
The way that the ban stands now, policy is could an APD officer use the knee to the back of the neck, pin somebody to the ground? Could they use that?
I don't think we've ever trained it to put your knee in their neck. I think the training method that is there is the head and the shoulders can tell you what the body's wanting to do, right? If you can control a head and you can control shoulders, you generally control the rest of the body. So generally, that cuffing technique, the knee is designed to go around the shoulder blades, and it's to help keep that subject flat, but also through your knee to be able to feel if they're trying to start to turn, rock, or resist, swing their body out in a certain way. Lastly, it's kind of a part of maybe even some like hand combat jiu-jitsu type training on going from control of the back, not neck, control of the back, to continue to gain control of an arm. And so if I can keep my knee on one side of the back, opposite of the arm I'm trying to bring back to handcuff, I have both platforms covered, at least for feel, to feel what the opponent in that example is doing, right? We've never, as a consideration as a choke move, a hold, a pressure, taught to put your knee on someone's neck. So it just, for us, it doesn't exist.
Just a couple of questions on the Saturday incident. We've all seen the video. It appears to be edited. Have you seen an unedited copy of that video, or do you have other video available?
We have not. We have requested it, and there was an indication by the Nice family, the folks associated with them, that they had more and that they were willing to share it with us. There's an indication they attempted to send it to us through the internet, but didn't have enough storage, or the internet didn't want to cooperate. But they've indicated they're going to meet with us and allow us to attempt to download that before we can have access to it and see what it looks like.
Initially, it said that the officer saw Mr. Nice throw something against the wall. Did anybody go to look to see what might have been thrown?
I don't know.
We're waiting on that to be factually reported on. We do know that a supervisor has conducted a neighborhood canvas area of that area, but I'm still waiting to have that part of the report make its way to me to be factual.
Just to kind of go off of his question, I believe initially it was said that the officer heard shots in that area, and that's when they saw Nice, his girlfriend, and family who were with him as well, including a 12-year-old. Suspicion anyone could have been walking within that area. Was it just one of those situations that was the first person who they came about, and that's why they began to question them, or could it have easily been someone else?
Well, I think that's really part of the point of the investigation that we're doing. None of us were there, of course, and we saw what you saw. We also have read the probable cause affidavit and the initial reports that both officers provided to us, and they really don't expound on that much beyond the fact that they did hear, or that he heard, what he thought might be gunfire, possibly fireworks. He wasn't certain, I don't think. But anyway, he basically relates that he got out to kind of investigate that, plus seeing the guy throw something up against the wall. And the other thing he reported to us, not to us, but in the reports, was that at least one of the persons in the group were somewhat aggressive towards him, and at the same time, Mr. Nice was walking away. I'd leave it to Officer Reynolds to explain what that meant to him. I know, having been involved in the system many years, that usually it's not unusual if a group of people are together and an officer pulls up and one person takes off more or less, even if it's just sort of moseying away, that sometimes that's an indication there may be something going on there. And maybe he doesn't want to be involved, but there could also be something else. So it's not unreasonable to say, hey, come back for a minute, let me talk to you. But again, keep in mind this is viewed ultimately from his viewpoint initially, I should say, and then we have to look at his reasoning and thoughts and the circumstances to ask ourselves, is that reasonable or not? And that's really where we're at right now, what we're trying to determine. But good question, but he's the one that probably needs to answer it.
Mayor, has the Nice family asked for any kind of a monetary settlement, or have you offered one at this point?
And neither has happened. Yes, sir.
Either you or
Sure.
Chief Brown could chime in on this one. You alluded to the fact that you're reaching out to some leaders in the black community to set up meetings and so forth. At this point, have you given any thought to maybe what form those meetings that you would like those meetings to take? Would it be in a public forum kind of setting, or are we thinking more along the lines of one-on-one meetings? Can you just maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, we've always had what I call an open door policy here in the city, and that's true of all of our departments. People have concerns or issues, they're welcome to come in and talk to us, make appointments, or just walk in if we're here. But we felt like it needs to be a little bit more of an aggressive reach out on our part, and so that's why, again, I've asked Officer Warren or Assistant Chief Warren to help kind of spearhead some of that in terms of reaching out to the different entities that we know living here. We kind of know who the people are that are most likely have interest or would have thoughts and concerns. Reach out to them and kind of let them take the lead and letting us know how they'd like to see that happen. If that means going down into a church basement with 7 or 8 of their leaders and listening to what they have to say, or showing up at a church congregation one day and hearing what they have to say, or ultimately getting together in a larger setting. For me personally, I feel like sitting down on a little smaller basis, at least initially, would help us gather information in a non-emotional, reasonable, factual way. And then at the same time later, though, if something more broadly needs to be done, that'd be fine too. But, sort of first step, so to speak. Yes, sir.
Can you clarify the status of both of these officers? Are they both on leave with pay, or is one suspended?
No. Yes, I'll be happy to. They are both on leave with pay, and that's indefinite. Technically, it won't be, of course, but it's indefinite until the investigation is completed, and then it goes up this chain of command I talked about, and a decision is made. The decision can be from one gamut to the other. It can even include being off without pay pending the outcome of investigation. But once you take away property rights from somebody, such as suspending their pay, then that triggers with them the right to have an immediate hearing. Well, since we're in the middle of an investigation, we really don't want an immediate hearing until we've collected the evidence. Once we've collected the evidence, then we'll be happy to have a hearing as quickly as someone wants. So that's the reason you just can't immediately go out and suspend somebody without pay under the state law.
If you could walk us through that timeline again of the investigation. I believe you said it should be wrapped up within the next few days internally, and then
I can tell you this: our investigators have been in contact with representatives of the officers, and they are in the process of putting together their written formal statement, so to speak, as to this investigation. Which is in addition to what they've already provided us as part of their official investigation of Mr. Nice. Once we get that, then we intend to sit down with them personally, and that would probably be within 2 to 3 days maximum of that, and to be able to follow up any questions that they might have supplied to us in order that we get a more real-time feel and pick some of the questions that and prick their brains for some of the answers that you guys have been asking. And then once that's done, that should put us pretty much close to wrapping everything up. And then the officer that's in charge of that will put together his findings, if you will, and all the details supporting that. And then that will be presented to Assistant Chief, and in this case we'll go to Assistant Chief Lee. He'll review it, and then he will look at the recommendations that were made. He'll also compare that to our orders, et cetera, and see if he sees that anything should be tweaked one way or the other. Decision can be made at that level, but most likely because of the nature of this situation, it will ultimately go to Chief Brown, who will look at it and then make his final decision and then make any recommendations that he wishes to the Safety Board. Keep in mind that, again, under Indiana law, a chief can, after that investigation is completed, a chief can suspend someone up to 5 days without going to the safety board. You report it to them, but you don't need their approval. If the officer wants wants a hearing on it, he can have a hearing. If the safety board agrees, they don't have to. But if it's more than 5 days, then there has to be, the safety board has to be the one to take the action, ultimately upon recommendation of the chief. And of course, there again, the person would be entitled to a hearing then if they want to have a hearing. So again, not trying to pre-guess what this thing's going to look like, because we don't know yet, but it could be, theoretically, in a theoretical case, it could be anything from don't do that again to you're terminated. It just depends on the facts, the circumstances, and the investigation will tell us that, and we'll go from there. Folks, I very much appreciate it. Appreciate the social distancing. Thank you so very much. I hope you guys all have a safe trip home. Thank you very much.